Around noon on October 21st, 1988, a man named Valentino sat at a cafe table sipping a coffee on a sidewalk in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this particular neighborhood was called Caballito, and it was right in the heart of Buenos Aires. It was very densely populated, and there were lots of tall apartment buildings and shops and cafes with tons of pedestrians and tons of traffic. And so as a result, it often felt very loud and chaotic, and today was no different. But Valentino, despite the craziness all around him, he still wanted to try to find a moment of peace as he had his coffee. And so he sort of sat back in his chair and he just looked up at the sky above all the urban noise, and he took this deep, calming breath. And as he did this, he saw a few birds fly by, and he just kind of smiled to himself, watching them fly on. But then he saw something else. Out of the corner of his eye, just across the street, he saw a flash of something brown plummeting towards the ground in front of a tall apartment building. And so Valentino turned his attention to look and see what this thing was. But what he saw didn't make any sense. There was this one old woman on the other side of the street who had stopped on the sidewalk, and she was staring down at what appeared to be like a pile of clothes at her feet. And the brown thing, the thing that caught Valentino's attention, which he couldn't make out what it was just a few feet away from this pile in front of this woman. But then, this old woman across the street, she just began screaming. And that's when Valentino realized that what he thought was like a pile of clothes at her feet was actually like a person, like a heap of a person on the ground. It was another old woman, and she was completely motionless on the ground. And so Valentino, he's shocked by what he's seeing. He's trying to make sense of it, and he's seeing again now, knowing it's a person on the ground and seeing this brown thing over here, and he's thinking, was that flash of brown, like that brown thing falling and striking this woman who's now motionless on the ground? Is that what happened? And as Valentino is sort of coming up with theories about what he's even looking at, it seemed like at the same time, the entire bustling neighborhood all around him also, just for a moment, stopped and just sort of paid attention to whatever madness was happening over there, as they too were trying to piece together what happened. But then, that brief moment of almost relative calm just completely dissipated, and the street once again descended into total chaos. Passerby and locals started shouting and racing over to the woman on the ground to help her, and very quickly this woman and the other woman who was screaming was completely surrounded by this huge crowd. And Valentino, for his part, he felt very shaken by what he was seeing, and just thinking about the fact that he might have seen effectively this woman get destroyed by whatever this brown thing was. He did see that flash of brown, and so he's sort of traumatized, and he's also, he's thinking he doesn't want to contribute to the pandemonium over there by running over to join the massive throng of people trying to figure out what happened. And so instead, he just stayed at his cafe table, with his coffee, and just watched as this crowd continued to build across the road. Finally, Valentino heard sirens, and he knew that meant an ambulance had to be close. But for some reason, even though he knew that was like objectively a good thing, help was on the way, maybe they can save this woman on the ground, he doesn't know. Even though he felt like he should feel relieved now that professionals are going to show up, they're going to clear the crowd, they're going to handle this, he just couldn't calm down. Like he literally couldn't stop. Like his heart was racing, his pulse was racing, his stomach was in knots. He felt terrible. It was like he was completely reliving this trauma that he's just experienced over and over and over again. As soon as the ambulance came into view and parked, the mass of people saw them and right away parted to let the paramedics come through to try to help this woman. And Valentino, from across the road, he was craning his neck to try and see, what was happening. And as he did, he saw this middle-aged woman who he didn't know crossing the street in the direction of this scene over there. And she just looked like she was just curious. And as she's crossing the road, she got destroyed by a city bus. It plowed directly into her, and she immediately disappeared underneath the bus's wheels. And so Valentino, whose heart was already basically beating out of his chest, he was so upset about everything, he shot to his feet like, what is going on here? Screams erupted from all around him, from other people who had seen the same horrible thing. And he could feel his heart just like racing nonstop, and sweat began dripping down his back. He was almost dizzy with shock, and he began to stagger away from his table, looking frantically around, calling out for somebody to actually help him. It was like his body couldn't handle what he was seeing. But nobody came because there were so many other things happening, horrible things that demanded immediate attention from other people, that no one's paying attention to Valentino having, a panic attack here. He's so low on the priority list. And so as he's sort of fumbling around the cafe, trying to get someone to help calm him down, nobody's paying attention to him. And so eventually Valentino kind of spiraled and then fell to the ground, and he found himself once more, on his back on the ground, staring up at the sky, watching birds fly across. What actually happened on that street in 1988 in Buenos Aires was so improbable that it made newspapers all across the world. So the first woman who was hit by the object that fell from the sky, the flash of brown, she died from the impact. And then that woman, the middle-aged woman who crossed the road to see what was going on, who got hit by the bus, she also died. And Valentino, who witnessed this entire thing, was so stunned and so horrified that he actually had a heart attack. And then he died on his way to the hospital. And so basically, these 3 fatalities that all occurred within minutes of each other were all connected, but were basically freak accidents that all had to happen in succession to even occur. And it all started when that brown thing plummeted through the air, the thing that caught Valentino's eye. And it would turn out that brownish object was actually the 4th victim in this tragedy. That object was actually a poodle named Khaki that had chased a ball straight off the balcony of its owner's 13th floor apartment. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring, because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. At 3 a.m. on Sunday, December 24th, 1967, 26-year-old Sammy Brown Jr. sped in his car down a road called Seal Road in Phoenix City, Alabama, with a police siren blaring right behind him. So Sammy was in trouble. It was Christmas Eve, and he had celebrated a little too hard and drank way too much, and he thought he'd be okay to drive home since he lived close by, but he'd been wrong, and he'd ultimately attracted the attention of a police officer who was now chasing him. And Sammy knew he could not get caught, because in addition to being very drunk, he also didn't even have a license to drive in the first place. And so that's why right now he was driving at 100 miles an hour to get away from this cop. But not only was the cop actually gaining on him, but also Sammy could see on the road up ahead that he had another problem, because there was another car in front of him driving in the same direction. And because this other car was actually going the speed limit, Sammy was going to smash into them if he didn't swerve around them. But this was not a highway where Sammy could just easily change lanes. It was a local 2-lane road. So Sammy knew that if he wanted to swerve around this car, he would have to swerve into the oncoming traffic lane. But since Sammy kind of looked and didn't see any other cars in that lane, he just decided to go for it and pray that he got lucky. So Sammy cut his wheel and tried to swerve around the slower car, But again, Sammy is extremely drunk. He's being chased by this cop who's gaining on him, so his anxiety is spiking. He's going so fast, and in this state of mind, Sammy actually misjudged the timing of his swerve, and he clipped the back of the slower car. And as soon as he did, there was this crunch of metal, and both cars began to spin out across the road before they sort of miraculously just came to a stop. Inside of his own car, Sammy sort of sat up and looked around and realized he was unhurt. And then when he looked out the window, he could see the driver of the other car, a man in his 60s, slowly get out and walk to his bumper to inspect the damage. And when Sammy saw this, he realized that despite how bad of a situation he was in, he actually had gotten very lucky. I mean, not only was he alive, but the man he had just hit, going nearly 100 miles an hour, also appeared to not just be alive, but basically seemed okay. Following the crash, Sammy expected to have some pretty harsh consequences, and he was charged for reckless driving and also driving without a license. But, sort of amazingly, his lucky streak actually would continue, because despite the charges, he didn't actually have to serve any jail time. He just had to pay a couple of fines, which meant Sammy really did not learn his lesson. And so, over a year later, on April 13th, 1969, Sammy once again spent all of his Saturday night drinking, and then at about 1:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, he got into that same car, which he still did not have a license to drive, and then he once again sped down Seal Road, the same road he got arrested on last December. And, wouldn't you know it, just like the last time, he saw a car ahead of him in his lane going too slow, and he decided to go around it. This time, however, he was not being chased by police, so he was not nearly as frantic or anxious. So he began shifting lanes much further away from this slower car. And when he moved into the opposing traffic lane, because of the distance he had given himself, he didn't clip the car in front of him. And for a split second, he felt an intense rush of satisfaction, because this was just more proof to Sammy that he was just an incredibly lucky guy. However, before Sammy could drive his car back into the correct lane, he went around a curve in the road and was immediately blinded by a searing bright light. Then there was a deafening bang, and Sammy's car jerked to the side, and all he saw was a violent swirl of motion as his car again spun around and then finally came to a stop. For a few moments, Sammy just sat there, feeling completely stunned. I mean, again, he's gotten into a high-speed wreck, and he's sort of taking stock of, did he even survive? But after a few moments, he realized he definitely had lived. His neck ached quite a bit from being shaken so hard, but other than that, he kind of looked around and he realized, once again, he was basically unhurt, so he had just gotten really lucky again. And so eventually, he climbed out of his car, and even though he was sort of dizzy from the crash, from the alcohol, when he took stock of what was in front of him, he could immediately see what had just happened. In his effort to avoid hitting the car that was driving in the same lane as him, he had swerved into oncoming traffic and hit a different car, another car, head on, that was driving in the opposite direction. This was like a worst-case scenario. And both his car and the one he had hit were completely destroyed, with the fronts completely smashed in. It was truly a miracle Sammy had walked out of that car. And so Sammy, he staggered over to look at the other car and see if the other driver and, potential passengers were okay. When he staggered over there, when he looked inside of the wreckage, he could not believe what he saw. Because what he saw inside was yet another miraculous stroke of luck. Only this time, it was not the good kind. Sammy had somehow managed to do something that really should have been impossible. He had almost perfectly recreated the accident that he had had a year earlier. He was driving the same car, going down the same road on the same day of the week, and he had crashed for basically the exact same reasons. And then when Sammy looked inside of the car he hit head on, he realized there was one more truly just incredible coincidence. The driver of this car was the same driver as the car he hit a year earlier. The man's name was Francis Patterson. He was 65 years old, and he didn't even live in Phoenix City where this crash happened. It was just a wild coincidence that 2 times, more than a year apart, Sammy had hit him while driving drunk on Seal Road. The only difference this second time around was Francis died from the crash. Following this tragedy, Sammy Brown Jr. was charged with driving while intoxicated and also involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison. On a Sunday night in early 1805, a 13-year-old boy named Émile Deschamps sat at a table full of adults in a house in Orléans, France. Now, Émile was supposed to be having dinner with all the other boys at his boarding school across the city, but his aunt had picked him up as a surprise for a home-cooked meal. And he knew why. His aunt was worried about him. So Émile's parents had sent him to this boarding school in Orléans a few years ago, but he hated the city, and basically right after he got there, his mother had died, and so Émile had really had a difficult time adjusting, and he felt lonely and isolated, and his aunt was definitely aware of that. And so tonight, Émile was very grateful that his aunt, because, she kind of felt bad for him, had brought him here to include him in this dinner, like he appreciated that. But this particular dinner was just full of adults that he didn't know, and it was just incredibly boring. In fact, right now, one of his aunt's middle-aged friends, this guy whose name was Monsieur Fonceboeuf, was just rambling on and on about his experience in the military, and, Émile was just not remotely interested. I mean, this was not exciting to him in the least, and so he did what he always did. He just sort of tuned this guy out and let his mind wander. Because Émile had this really big imagination, and he would routinely, especially when he was, lonely and sad at school, he would just kind of disappear into his own thoughts. But quickly, after he sort of began letting his mind wander, he was pulled right back to reality when his aunt set the dessert down right in the middle of the table. So this dessert was a brown, sauce-drenched cake-like thing that was actually wrapped in a cloth and was piping hot, literally steam coming off of it. And Émile, he just kind of stared at it because he had never seen a dessert like this before and had no idea what it was. And so as he was staring at it, he heard a voice at the table say, "Oh, it was plum pudding, and Émile, you should try this." Émile looked over at the voice who had said this, and it belonged to Monsieur de Fontainebeau, who was smiling at him. This is the guy who had been rambling about his military experience. And the Monsieur repeated that Émile really needed to try a slice of this plum pudding, because it was an amazing traditional English dessert, and it was just absolutely delicious. So Émile let his aunt cut him a slice, and then he took a bite. And he was glad he did, because it really was incredible. It was this rich and sweet and just perfectly warm dessert. I mean, this was like one of the best desserts he had ever had. And so after trying this plum pudding and, telling the monsieur how great it was and thanking his aunt, he just kind of went back to letting his mind wander, and the conversation at the table picked back up again, and, it was just boring adult talk, and the night just kind of continued as is. And then at some point in the night, when the meal and the dessert and everything had all been eaten up, the guests parted ways, and Émile went back to his boarding school. And quickly, when he got back to his boarding school, he forgot about the dinner and the pudding and the monsieur, and just carried on with his life. One afternoon, 10 years later, in the spring of 1815, Émile was 23 years old, and he was living in Paris, about 80 miles away from Orléans. So Émile had basically fled Orléans as soon as he was old enough to strike out on his own. And once he had turned his big imagination into a blossoming career. He was now a poet and a playwright, and he was writing about these big, sweeping human experiences like love and chaos and how mysterious life can be. So Émile that day had basically been writing nonstop and had sort of lost track of time and sort of forgot to eat. And then suddenly he felt super hungry. And so now here he was out and about looking for something to eat. But he was so hungry that he decided he didn't even care where he went. I mean, normally he was picky about where he would eat lunch and dinner, but today he just wanted food. He didn't care where it was. And so he just randomly chose a cafe and went inside. It was a small space with a few customers sitting at some tables, and Émile just walked in and took a seat at an empty one. And quickly thereafter, a waitress came over and handed Émile a menu, and when he flipped it open, he was immediately drawn to the dessert section. He saw this cafe served plum pudding, the amazing English dessert that he had had a decade earlier at that dinner party with his aunt and the monsieur. He had not had plum pudding from that day to now. It had been 10 years. He had just not had it, but he saw it on the menu and he's like, oh my goodness, I gotta have plum pudding again. That was so good 10 years ago. I gotta have that experience again. And so Emile asked this waitress if he can have a slice of their plum pudding. And she just shook her head and said, I'm sorry, but the last piece we had, I actually just served it to the guy over there. Like, we don't have any more. And the waitress, she saw Emile react to this and he was like so distraught. He's like, oh man, really? Like, there's no more? Are you serious? And the waitress could sense like he really, really wanted this plum pudding. And so she goes, well, hold on a minute. And she turns and she calls out to the gentleman that she had actually just given the last piece to, who was sitting in the corner of the cafe. And she calls to him and says, hey, would you mind sharing that last piece with this new guest here, with Emile? Because he wants a piece of this plum pudding. And so Emile, he kind of looks around the waitress in the direction of the person that she's speaking to, the guy with the actual plum pudding. And the guy who's sitting over there, he looks up, and wouldn't you know it, it's Monsieur de Fontainebleau, the same guy who was at the dinner party 10 years earlier, who encouraged Emile to eat plum pudding for the first time and only time in his whole life at that point. It's the same guy. Like, they're not even in Orléans, France. They're 80 miles away in Paris. And Emile, he's chosen a random cafe. He'd never been here before, and he just happened to see plum pudding on the menu. Like, what are the odds that it's the same guy and they're having plum pudding? Like, the coincidence here is just unbelievable. And so Emile, he sort of says to the waitress, hold on a minute, I know him. And so Emile, he gets up and walks over to the monsieur, and he sits down next to him, and they're both like, this is crazy. It's been 10 years, and here we are eating plum pudding together again. Like, what are the odds? And so for the next 15 minutes or so, the two men just caught up about their respective lives. They ate this plum pudding. And then at the end of it, they were like, all right, like, great, nice to see ya. And they both just went their separate ways, with the monsieur going back to whatever he does and Emile going back to his writing. 38 years later, at 6 p.m. on a winter evening in 1853, Emile sat at a tea party in Paris, having a great time as he chatted with the other guests at his table. He'd been invited to this party by the hostess, who was a big admirer of his work. And there were actually a lot of people like that these days. Emile was now in his 60s, and he was very well known. He'd published tons of plays and poems and translations, and he was close friends with many of the literary giants of France and Europe. Like, he had made it as a creative. And so as Emile is sitting at this table, basically being lauded for, all of his achievements and what an incredible writer he was, as he's just sitting there basking in the glory, one of the hostess's staff came in with a platter of dessert. And Emile, he looked over and he saw what the dessert was, and right away he knew he had to have some. It was plum pudding. And so as the staff person came over with the plum pudding to give to Emile, he sort of laughed and told, the staff person and the people at his table the story of how, over the course of his life, he'd only had plum pudding 2 times, when he was 13 and when he was 23. And in both of those situations, when he had had plum pudding, this guy, Monsieur de Fontainebleau, had been present. This man that he didn't know and had only interacted with when he was eating plum pudding. And it was kind of like this crazy coincidence. He described seeing him 10 years later in Paris. He couldn't believe it. That was 38 years ago, but still, it's like this wild coincidence, the biggest one of his whole life. And so he sort of jokingly told the people at the table and the staff, like, hey, here I am about to eat for the 3rd time plum pudding. We better be on the lookout for the monsieur. He's bound to show up. And everyone kind of laughed. They're like, yeah, that's crazy. And so Emile, he gets his plate of plum pudding. He gets his fork and he scoops a bite, and he's about to eat it when the butler walks into the room and announces that there is going to be one more guest joining them at this tea party. And who walks in, this additional guest? None other than Monsieur de Fontainebleau. And so Emile, he's about to bite the plum pudding, and he looks up and he sees him and he can't believe it. I mean, the guy is like 1,000 years old and he hasn't seen him for 38 years. And the only other times are when he's eating plum pudding. And wouldn't you know it, for the 3rd time here, it's happening again. Like, this is unbelievable. It was crazy the second time. This is now impossible. How is it that he's here as I'm about to eat for the third time this plum pudding? It doesn't make sense. And so Emile just stared at the monsieur with this look of just absolute shock on his face. And the monsieur, as he walked in, he sort of stopped and scanned the room, and he eventually met eyes with Emile. And he had this look of just total confusion on his face. He's looking at Emile, he's seeing the plum pudding that he's eating, kind of, scoping out the whole room. And then the monsieur, he just turned around and he walked away. It would turn out Monsieur de Fontaibu had been invited to another party on the same floor and had mistakenly wandered into Emile's party at the exact moment he was being served plum pudding for the third time in his entire life. This was truly just an astounding set of coincidences over, a 50-year period. Like, the odds of this all happening exactly as it did those 3 different times he had plum pudding and there was the monsieur, for things to line up that way, it was just staggering to imagine how perfectly each coincidence had to line up. It was almost so much that Emile felt like, there's got to be something else going on here. This can't just be coincidence. It was just like too much. And so, in fact, Emile would go on to recount his plum pudding and the monsieur story many, many times to his friends in literary circles, and he would ultimately write about it in his eventual memoir. Today, it's been around 200 years since the plum pudding events took place. And during that time, Emile's account has been dissected countless times by probability experts and scientists and mathematicians from all around the world. And nobody has a good answer for how this could have happened. And so in the end, Emile's account about what happened to him actually ended up becoming the foundation for a very famous philosophical concept pioneered by Carl Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity basically means that some coincidences might not actually be coincidences. They might not be random at all, but instead are actually connected to a much larger meaning or purpose, even if we don't know what that is. Late on a winter night in the 1970s, a middle-aged train driver named Takashi Ito, along with his assistant, were sitting in the front seat of a small cargo train that was hurtling along the tracks in Hokkaido, Japan. So this was just a 2-car train. There was a cargo train in back, and then there was the front train that, Takashi and his assistant were in. There were no passengers behind them, so it's just these two. And the area that they were driving through was this very desolate area. And basically outside, if they looked out their windshield, all they would have seen was just basically snow and ice and just pitch black darkness and the train's headlights pointing straight ahead. That would have been all they could see, was whatever, was in the headlights. And as they were driving along, they had shut all the windows to the car that they were in, but it was so cold outside and the wind was whipping and they're driving right into the wind that some of the cold air was coming in one of the windows. And, it's freezing cold out there. It was starting to get really cold inside the cabin. And so, both men are starting to shiver. And so at some point, Takashi turns to his assistant and he just tells him to, hey, go ahead and open up the heating vent on the floor. So there was just this little vent that you could open up that would basically expose the engine to the main cabin, and so some heat would come up from the engine. But it would get really hot really quickly, and so you couldn't do it for very long, but it was getting pretty cold. So the situation called for it. And so Takashi sort of had one eye half focused out the windshield, sort of roughly following along with the direction they were going. And then the rest of his attention was just on his assistant, who was doing this mundane task of crouching down and sliding open this vent here. And at some point, the assistant managed to open up the heating box. And right as he did, something caught Takashi's eye outside of the train. Now, remember, it's the middle of the night, it's the dead of winter, there's really nothing out there. And even though, of course, it's Takashi's job to pay attention to what's out in front of them, there's no expectation he's going to see anything on the tracks at all until he gets to the next stop, which was quite a ways away. And so the fact that anything caught his attention was alarming, and he turns and he looks out the windshield and he can't believe what he sees right in the middle of the tracks. Just several dozen yards ahead of the speeding train is a woman. She's just standing in the middle of the tracks looking up at the train,
and doesn't even appear to be trying to move, but she clearly sees the train barreling down on her. She looks terrified, and Takashi and the assistant, they look at each other, they start trying to get the train to stop, but there's no way. The train's going way too fast, it's way too heavy, and so it's like they throw the brakes on, they're trying to stop, but there's nothing they can do, and this woman, she's just not moving. And then eventually the train smashes into her, and like Takashi and the assistant are like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And the train, it eventually comes to a grinding stop, several hundred yards away. And then finally, when it's actually stopped, it's like Takashi and the assistant, they know what's happened. They've just killed someone. I mean, it's clearly an accident, but like the shock of this was unbelievable. And so finally, Takashi, he looks at the assistant and he's like, we have to go out and see if she's okay. I mean, they both knew there was no chance. Like, there's no chance she's alive after being hit by the train. But out they go, and sort of apprehensively, they begin walking in the snow towards the back of the train. Now, neither of them had a lighting source. They didn't have a flashlight or anything like that. And they're going towards the back of the train. So they don't have the advantage of the headlights shining where they need to go. All they have are the taillights of the train, which are now flashing red. And so as they're walking through the snow and the wind is whipping and it's pitch black out there, and of course these two men, they're in shock about what they've just seen. They can't believe, like, what was she doing out here? Like, what happened? They're walking and all they're seeing out in front of them is darkness and the occasional, flash of red light that sort of roughly illuminated the snow out beyond the train, and then back to darkness. And they know somewhere out there behind the train is this woman who almost certainly is dead. So it means that there's like a dead body out there. And so Takashi and the assistant, they start making their way back towards the back of the cargo train, and then they begin walking beyond where the train was, basically along the tracks they had just covered. And sure enough, up ahead, periodically illuminated by these red lights, was this, mound on the tracks. It looked very much like a body. And sure enough, as Takashi got closer, he realized it was the woman. And almost immediately, he could tell, one, she was definitely dead. And in some ways, he kind of hoped maybe, there was some miracle that she had survived somehow, maybe, but definitely confirmed that she's dead. And the second thing was he could sort of see what happened here. Her foot appeared to be wedged in the tracks. She must have been stuck in the tracks. And even though it looked like she wasn't trying to move, it might have been because she literally couldn't. And so she was trapped, and we hit her and we killed her. But that wasn't all. I mean, this scene was horrible. I mean, her body was destroyed. But more than that, part of her body was missing. All they saw on the tracks were actually just her legs. It was just her lower half, and she had these lace-up dance shoes that would have been very difficult to take off. The dance shoes sort of gave away that this was the woman. They look like feminine legs, feminine feet. But again, her upper half is just gone. And so Takashi and the assistant, they sort of look around in the general vicinity to see if, her upper half is nearby. And again, all they have is this periodic red flashing light across the snow, and it's dark, it's cold, the wind is whipping. And sure enough, just a little ways off the tracks, they see another sort of heap on the ground, and there's nothing else out here. So this has got to be the woman's upper body. And so they cross over the tracks, they leave behind the lower half, and they see there's like a trail of blood across the snow. And when they get to this second mound, it is this woman's upper body. But I mean, the scene, it would have been horrible for anyone to find this, but it was especially so because as they walked up to this woman's clearly, dead upper half, she was looking right at them. I mean, her arms were outstretched and her eyes were open, and her torso, it's positioned in such a way that she was almost like staring at them. And they walk up to her, and her face, Takashi would say that it was almost like she was looking at him with an accusatory look, like she was mad at him for not having stopped the train. Couldn't you see I was trapped on the train? Like, that's what Takashi's thinking. Like, this dead woman is mad at me. She looks like she's furious with me. And so, it was very hard, but they continued walking towards her to, just really confirm that she's definitely dead. This is not like a second person here, but no, it was clearly just the upper half of this woman, and she was definitely dead. And despite the the very unsettling nature of the way her body was positioned, ultimately, Takashi and the assistant, just turned around and began walking back towards the train. Now, this is 1970s Japan. They don't have cell phones. In fact, they didn't even have radios. Like, they didn't have a good way to get in touch with anyone. They clearly knew they needed to tell authorities what happened here, but realistically, the only way to do that was to go to the train, and then one of them would have to basically walk to the nearest civilization and get help that way, while the other person stayed with the train and also with the woman. And so the two of them, they get back to the train, they get inside of that front car, inside of the enclosed warm space, and they shut the doors, and they sort of just look at each other like, okay, this is obviously horrible, but what are we going to do? And Takashi, being the more senior of the two, said, well, look, I'll stay here with the train. You, the assistant, go out and get help. I'll be here when you come back.
When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today.
And so the assistant, as much as it was sort of daunting to have to walk off into the darkness and the freezing cold, it almost was like a relief to get away from this scene. I mean, this was truly horrific. And so, Takashi watched as the assistant bundled up in his jacket and he headed out the side of the car door, and then off into the darkness he went. And then Takashi was left alone inside of the train with, this woman's body behind them on the tracks. And so shortly after the assistant had gone, Takashi, he's just sitting inside of this unmoving train car. And remember, they had that heating vent open. And even though the train was not moving, there was still quite a bit of heat that was coming up into the cabin. And so it was actually getting quite toasty inside of this train car. And Takashi is literally just not moving. He's just sitting there waiting, just trying not to let his mind wander to this horrible thing that's happened behind him. And he found himself actually feeling kind of tired. I mean, he had had a really long day. I mean, he'd been up for nearly 24 hours at this point. And so suddenly he was like, man, maybe I ought to just lay down and close my eyes for a minute, because obviously when they come back here, they'll wake me up, like no problem. And so Takashi did eventually get down on the ground right next to that vent. So he was really getting the maximum amount of heat. And he curled up and he closed his eyes. But pretty much immediately, once Takashi closed his eyes and effectively attempted to sleep, all he could see in his mind was that woman standing on the tracks looking up at him before she was struck by the train. And then he would try to, force himself not to think about that, telling himself it really was an accident. He could not have stopped the train. And also, they rounded a corner before they saw her. It wasn't like they could have seen her if they hadn't been fiddling around with the heating vent beforehand. They wouldn't have seen her. They had to turn that corner, and then they saw her. Like, there was no way to avoid this. This was an accident. But it's like he couldn't get that image of the woman out of his mind. And then if he managed not to think about her on the tracks, his mind would then jump to seeing her upper half positioned on the snow with her eyes still open, looking at him with this, in his mind, this sort of accusatory look on her face. And so he can't sleep, but he's so exhausted from the day and he's just so worn out, it's so traumatic that eventually, after, 10 minutes or so, he did begin to feel himself sort of allowing himself to drift off to sleep. Like, he did have these horrible thoughts, but he felt himself getting closer to finally being able to get a little bit of sleep. And right at that point, right as he's teetering on actually sleeping, he hears something outside. Now, remember, it's late at night, the wind is whipping, it's the middle of winter, and so there had been this ongoing ambiance of the howling wind and nighttime winter sounds outside. There are animals out there. I mean, there's lots of noises going on here. But whatever the sound was, he just couldn't quite place it. It almost sounded like metallic, like something was scraping against something else, like maybe two pieces of metal were grinding together, like shk, shk. But he couldn't quite tell what it was, how far away it was. But but it really stood out right away amongst all the other noises he was hearing. And so he's laying there on the ground and he's listening to the sound. He can't quite place how close or far away it is. For all he knows, it could be way off in the distance, or it could be right in the cargo train behind him. And so as he hears this sound, which is sort of periodic, he tells himself, like, oh, maybe it's my assistant. Maybe he's back with help. Maybe he found someone really quickly, because it's only been like 10 minutes since he left. But then he's thinking, like, there's no way. Like, I know we're sort of in the middle of nowhere. We're in this really desolate part of Japan. Like, there's no way he would have just magically found help that quickly. So it can't be my assistant. Unless maybe he's turned around for some reason, but, why would he do that? And so he's sort of picturing, like, what were the reasons that it could be the assistant? And as he's doing that, the sound is getting louder. And it's definitely getting closer. And the sound is, again, it's like a it's like a grinding sort of like movement almost, like something's coming towards him. And he can tell now that the sound, whatever it is definitely near like the cargo train. Like it's right behind where he is. And the way he's laying, his head is towards the front of the train, so his feet are close to the door that led out into the open and then would eventually lead you to the cargo train behind. And so he's starting to get sort of apprehensive. Like, what is that? Is it like an animal? Like, could it be the wind? Is it like somehow whipping against the train in some way that it's making this strange sound? And all the while, this grinding sort of like rhythmic sound is getting louder and louder and sort of faster and faster. And then finally, as the sound is so loud that it's practically echoing inside of this room he's in, he hears the door to where he is slide open. And he turns and he looks to see what is coming into the train. And when he sees what it is, he starts to scream. About an hour later, Takashi's assistant, who had managed to go get help, was in the back seat of a police cruiser along with 2 police officers who were driving in the direction of this train. There was actually a road that kind of cut out into this sort of desolate area that overlooked the train tracks. And sure enough, they pulled into this sort of carve out on the road. And the assistant pointed, and there it was. There was the train sort of off in the distance, sort of walking distance from where the car was. And so the cops, they parked, and all 3 of them, they get out, and the police officers, they had flashlights. And so it was much easier to navigate the sort of barren terrain here. And they walked away from the car down to the train. Now, remember, obviously, there has been a tragedy here. This woman was struck by the train, and of course the police know this by this point, and the assistant knows that's what they're walking up to, the scene of this woman being killed. But there really wasn't anything, sort of darker than that. Like, this was a terrible accident, but it's sort of like we just got to follow protocol now. We got to go down there, we got to figure out what happened, and sort of, follow process, if you will. And so the 3 of them, they know what they're walking into, right? They're going to meet Takashi. He's waiting in the train, and they're going to take it from there. And so they're walking through the darkness, and they're shining their lights, and the assistant is behind the 2 police officers, and they're walking up to the train. And when they get close enough to the train, the assistant begins yelling out for Takashi to let him know, like, hey, we're here. We're here. Like, come on out. But Takashi doesn't call back. He doesn't come out of the train. But again, this is not like hugely alarming. The assistant's like, okay, maybe he fell asleep inside of the train car. And so the 2 police officers and the assistant, they make their way over to the door that leads into the front car of the train, and they slide it open and they step inside. It's a very small space, and Takashi's not in there. And there's no sign of anything bad that's happened. He's just not in here. And so the assistant's like, okay, that's weird. It's sort of odd that he didn't respond to us calling for him. He's not in here, but maybe he's in the cargo train, the second car for some reason. And so they leave the front train car and they go into the cargo train car, and Takashi's not in there either. And so at this point, the cops are looking at the assistant like, what's going on here? Like, where would Takashi be? It's the middle of the night. Like, it's just pure barren wasteland. It's ice and snow everywhere. Why would he leave? And so the assistant's like, maybe he left and he's with the body. Maybe he was just standing with the body or something. And so the 2 police officers and the assistant, they begin walking towards the back of the train and then begin following the tracks towards where, the lower half of this woman is, according to the assistant. And so down the tracks they go, and sure enough, eventually they see up ahead the legs that are sort of still stuck in the tracks. And as they're shining the light and they're calling out for Takashi, there's no answer, and Takashi is nowhere to be found. And so now the assistant's really getting worried. Like, it didn't make any sense. Where could he have gone? The only other place that made any sense was maybe over near the torso. But the assistant knows, like, of all places that at least he would want to be, it would not be near the upper half. I mean, that was so creepy. The way the body was positioned, the way it was staring at them. And he knew Takashi had been really unsettled by it. So why would he go over to that? But he told the cops, like, hey, shine the light sort of over there off the tracks, because the upper half of this woman, that's where she is. Maybe he's over there. And so they shine their lights in the direction of where the upper half was. And there's no Takashi. And there's no upper half. There is no torso. The woman's torso is gone. And where it was, very clearly, is this huge sort of like flattened section of snow with blood everywhere. And it's like this just horrible scene, but there's no upper body. So Takashi's gone, and this woman's body, her upper half anyways, is gone. And so now, like, the assistant and the officers, they really don't know what to make of this. But the first thought, at least from the assistant, was, maybe a bear came through and was, basically taking the woman's body to go eat it or something. And maybe Takashi was out here and maybe he got chased off by the bear, or worse, maybe he got attacked by the bear. And this sort of made sense. Like, oh my God, like, is there a bear nearby? Like, do we need to go in the train just to seek safety here? And so the police officers, they're sort of scanning their lights around, trying to see if maybe Takashi's nearby. And at some point they notice there's actually boot prints that leave where the torso had been. And they sort of took off into the night, sort of away from the train, sort of off into the distance. Now, there didn't appear to be any bear tracks around, but again, they're thinking that's what it could be, but they see these boot prints and they're like, we gotta go check. We gotta see if maybe these prints will lead us to Takashi. And so Takashi and the two officers, they begin following these tracks, and as they do, they see the prints, these boot prints, get farther and farther apart, like Takashi was running, like his stride was getting longer and longer, and there's blood everywhere, like this drag mark of blood all over the snow. And they follow these prints all the way past the train, way off into the night, where they finally stop in front of this huge utility pole. And at this point, they're looking around like, where's Takashi? Like, where did he go? Like, there's nothing down here. And then at some point, they hear something above them. And so the police officers, with their flashlights, they shine up towards the top of this utility pole, where at the top, there was this fairly large metal platform. And as they shine their lights up, they see Takashi. And he's draped over the edge of this platform, totally lifeless. His arms are dangling down, and he's got this horrible, huge wound across his stomach. He's bled all over. He's clearly deceased. And so they're shining their lights up at him, and like the shock of seeing Takashi is horrible. They back up. They're like, oh my God, is there a bear here? Did the bear somehow get up there with Takashi? Like, what's making that noise up there? And they're shining their lights, and at some point they hear a noise again. And then as their lights are aimed towards Takashi in this platform, this figure sort of emerges above Takashi, like it crawled over Takashi, and it peered down at the two cops and the assistant. And it was the woman's torso. It's like her upper half. She sort of looked down at them, blood's all over her, and she's sort of clutching on to Takashi. And then in one move, she sort of thrust herself over his body and began pulling herself down the pole towards the men. And the men, they immediately start yelling, and they turn and they start running. And as they're running off, all they can hear behind them is chick, 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 which is the sound of this woman dragging herself through the snow towards them. Now, unfortunately, the assistant did not make it. The woman caught up to him. But the two police officers, they were able to run back to their car. They got in and they sped off towards the station, and they told people what was going on at this train. I mean, they couldn't even describe it really without it sounding totally made up. And so eventually, reinforcements head back to the train. And when they get there, they find the assistant. He clearly had been caught by this woman on his way to the car, and he was destroyed. His stomach was ripped wide open. He was dead. But, the authorities, they searched everywhere, and they couldn't find this woman. Her upper half was just gone. Her legs were still stuck in the tracks, but the murderous upper half of her was gone, and they never found her. Today, it's said that the animated top half of this woman's corpse still haunts the railroad tracks in Hokkaido. She's known as Tiki Tiki because that is the name that was given to sort of encapsulate the sound that she would make as she pulled herself through the snow. The sort of chk, chk sound became Tiki Tiki. Now, according to some versions of this story, after you've heard the legend of Tiki Tiki, like you have now, you only have 3 days before she shows up to get you. But it is possible to survive it. Before she slices you in half across your midsection, she'll pause to ask you one question. And if you answer this question correctly, she'll let you live. The question is, do you need your legs? And the only correct answer, spoken exactly like this, is yes, I need them right now.
On the morning of Sunday, July 13th, 2003, 26-year-old Tabitha Bryant walked through the front door of her big white house in Penfield, New York, which was an upper-middle-class suburb of Rochester. Her husband, Kevin, and their 2 young sons followed her inside, and they were all dressed in their Sunday best because they had just come back from church. However, on this morning, Tabitha sort of felt like a fraud because she knew she was not really living a Christian lifestyle. So Tabitha was actually having an affair with a guy named Keith. And her husband, Kevin, who was 45 and nearly 20 years her senior, he had recently found out about it and confronted her about it. Tabitha, during this confrontation, had promised Kevin that she would end the affair. And then she and Kevin had agreed that they really needed to work on their marriage together. But despite sort of coming to a kind of resolution, it was very obvious that Kevin was still very mad at her. And so Tabitha had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den ever since. Now, Tabitha watched as Kevin grabbed his briefcase off the kitchen counter, he kissed their 2 boys goodbye, and then he walked back out to his car. Tabitha was used to him disappearing to the office on the weekends. Kevin was a lawyer, and he worked basically all the time. And, they did depend on his salary, his big salary, to pay their mortgage and also finance their expensive lifestyle with vacations and lots of nights out. Now, despite Kevin's salary being so sizable, they had for a while tried to supplement his income by renting out a bedroom in their house to Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril Weinbrenner, and his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. However, that arrangement, despite it being profitable for the couple, had ultimately soured when Cyril, the half-brother, had begun using drugs inside of the house. And so Cyril and Cassidy had moved out 2 months earlier. But despite, the terms on which they left, the group, Cyril, Cassidy, Tabitha, Kevin, their family, they remained friends, and they would still actually spend time together on the weekends. It was just they were not able to live together. Now, Tabitha, she did like having that extra money coming in, but the truth was having her whole house back to herself was ultimately a good thing. Like, she felt relieved in some ways. But also there was a part of her that sort of missed having, her half-brother and Cassidy around. Especially when Kevin was, gone all the time working. Like, she just felt lonely. And also, on top of just being lonely, Tabitha often was the one saddled with childcare. They had a toddler and a 5-year-old, and, she was just sort of taking care of kids all the time, or sort of isolated. It was just exhausting. And now, as she watched Kevin back his car out of the driveway, she could tell today was going to be another long, exhausting, lonely day. That night, around 9 p.m., Tabitha was fast asleep on Kevin's bed with one of their sons when she felt somebody shaking her. And when she opened her eyes and looked up, she saw Kevin standing right over her. And he leaned down and he whispered to her that it was very late and that Tabitha should go to her bed out on the pull-out couch. And then he picked up their sleeping son and carried him off to the boys' bedroom without waiting for a response from Tabitha. As Tabitha got out of bed, she thought about just staying put and insisting on sleeping in the master bedroom that night. But, their kids were already asleep, and she also didn't want to risk getting into a fight with Kevin, especially at this hour, and waking everyone up. And so ultimately she decided against it and just left the bedroom and headed downstairs to the den. And then when she got there, Tabitha unfolded the pull-out couch and lay down, and she tried to fall asleep, but after tossing and turning for a while, she just pulled out her phone, and she pulled up the number for Keith, the guy she'd been having an affair with. As she did this, she reminded herself that she had promised to end things with Keith. But she was also feeling sort of desperate for someone to talk to. And Kevin was clearly very intentionally shutting her out, so after a moment, Tabitha hit the call button. Later that same night, around midnight, 911 operator Jacqueline Sanabria had just started her shift at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office when a call came in. Jacqueline answered it, and immediately this man's voice came over the line saying his wife had just been shot. And so right away, Jacqueline followed protocol, and as calm as she could, she asked the man, had he attempted CPR? And the man, in this eerily calm voice, said no, he hadn't. And the reason he gave was there was simply too much blood. At 1:45 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 2 hours after that 911 call, Sergeant Paul Sienna of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of a large white house with black shutters and an attached garage. There were a bunch of police cruisers and forensics vans that were already on the scene, and Sienna could see neighbors who were kind of coming outside, watching from their lawns and driveways, trying to figure out what was going on. Sienna had been very surprised when he had gotten the call from dispatch about a murder in Penfield, because Penfield was a really nice, safe area. In fact, there had not been a single murder there in more than 40 years. Now, he climbed out of his car and walked over to the front lawn where 3 deputies were interviewing this middle-aged man who looked like he might have just gotten out of bed. One of the deputies saw Sergeant Sienna, and so he ran over to him and began to brief him on what they knew. He explained to Sienna that the man they were speaking to was Kevin Bryant. He was the man who had called 911, and he was the husband of the victim, Tabitha Bryant. The deputy said that Tabitha and Kevin's 2 young sons had been inside the house at the time of the shooting, but their grandparents had picked them up a few minutes ago. The house itself had already been searched, and there were no signs of forced entry, but it was not hard to guess how the killer or killers got inside. The garage door had been left open, and then the door between the inside of the garage and the inside of the house had been left unlocked. So basically anybody off the street could have just waltzed into the house. Now, Sienna knew that in nice, safe neighborhoods like Penfield, it was not unusual for people to leave their doors and garage doors unlocked or even open. But at the same time, he did think it was a little unusual that it just so happened that on the night of the shooting, the house was unsecured. So he wasn't really sure what to make of that. At this point, Sienna glanced over at the husband, Kevin, and he saw Kevin suddenly bend over and start dry heaving. Now, Sienna definitely wanted to talk to Kevin, but really he needed to check out the crime scene first. And also considering how, Kevin did not appear to be ready to talk right now, he figured he should just go inside and have a look around. So he ducked under the police tape that was roping off the garage, and he made his way inside. Once inside the house, Sienna passed the kitchen and also a playroom, and they looked relatively normal. And then he got to the den, and there was nothing normal about the den. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and there were all these forensic technicians that were inside of the den, furiously swabbing all over the room, trying to take samples of all this blood and also trying to photograph the entire scene. And in the middle of all this chaos happening in the den, Sienna saw the victim, Tabitha Bryant. She was laying on the pull-out couch bed. As Sienna walked over to the body to get a closer look, right away he saw this was not just a shooting, because Tabitha had, more than a dozen stab wounds to her chest and her neck. And then also right below her right eye, there was this small, clean hole that Sienna recognized as a gunshot wound. This was an excessive amount of violence, and it made Sienna think that this could have been a crime of passion. And the fact that Tabitha clearly had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den instead of in bed with her husband made Tabitha's husband, Kevin, Sienna's prime suspect. I saw something on CNBC about hiring that really stuck with me. So nearly half of hiring managers say that a candidate's enthusiasm matters the most. And that makes sense because you can teach skills, you can train someone how to do the job, but you can't really teach someone to care. And when someone actually wants to be there, you notice it right away. And ZipRecruiter has a new feature that quickly lets you see the most interested, qualified candidates first, so you meet the right people faster. And now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Ballin. ZipRecruiter's smart matching technology connects you with qualified candidates instantly, and candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. No wonder ZipRecruiter is the #1 rated hiring site based on G2. Use ZipRecruiter and find enthusiastic talent fast. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And again, now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Ballin. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/Ballin. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter. At 8:40 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 9 hours after Tabitha Bryant was killed, Sergeant Paul Sienna sat across from her husband, Kevin, at a diner in Rochester, New York. Now, normally, Sienna would conduct interviews like this at the sheriff's office, but he was starving after spending all night on his feet at the crime scene, and he also hoped that, this informal setting would hopefully get Kevin to be a bit more talkative. So Sienna was suspicious of Kevin, one, because he was the husband of the victim, and right away, in murder cases, spouses are regarded as early suspects, and then also just this unusually violent murder. I mean, the murder itself was rare in a town like this, but it was just so violent, so much gore and blood. It just sort of screamed, this is a personal attack. This is a crime of passion. Again, making Kevin seem sort of suspicious here. However, the physical evidence made it look like Kevin actually could not have done it. He didn't have any blood or defensive injuries on him, which would make sense if he was the killer. I mean, given how much blood was at the scene, there should be some on him. And Sienna had checked the sinks and showers at the house to see if maybe Kevin had gotten blood on himself but cleaned himself up before police arrived. But there was no sign that there had been blood in the drains. Plus, the police had spent all night searching the house for murder weapons, a gun and maybe a knife, and so far they hadn't found anything. Still though, Sienna was not ready to, outright dismiss Kevin as a suspect, and he was looking for any holes in Kevin's story at this point. As Kevin had already explained multiple times by this point, he said he had come home from work around 9 p.m. the night before. He said he took the trash out, and then he went right up to his bedroom to read, while Tabitha was asleep on the pull-out couch downstairs. But at around 11:30 p.m., Kevin said he had gotten a very strange phone call. He had answered, and it was a woman, and she had said hello, but then it was silent, and there was just static on the line. Kevin eventually had just hung up and said he thought it was just a wrong number. But then he said a little while later, just before midnight, he'd heard gunshots and screams. Kevin said at that point he got up and he ran to his kids' bedrooms first to make sure they were safe, and when he saw they were, then he went downstairs and he found Tabitha dead in the den. And so now Sienna, sitting across from Kevin in their booth, he asked him, do you have any idea who could have done this? And Kevin, he paused for a moment, and then when he spoke, his voice cracked, and he actually began to cry as he sort of choked out that his wife's death was his fault. Now, at first, Sienna thought, oh my goodness, is this guy about to confess? Did he kill her? Is he going to tell me that? But when he pressed Kevin to continue, what do you mean by that? Kevin very tearfully would say that, he thought he maybe was the one who had left the garage open when he had taken out the trash, and he suspected that that must have been how the killer or killers got inside. And then, sort of oddly, Kevin continued and basically began to lay out this whole theory for what might have happened that night, sort of unprompted. He's giving his opinion. Kevin said, as he saw it, a burglar must have driven by, saw their garage was open, and decided to rob the house. However, he said when they went inside the house to rob it, they must have been caught off guard when they saw Tabitha in the den. And she must have woken up, and there must have been some sort of confrontation, and the burglar or burglars must have panicked and killed her and then fled without even robbing the place. That's probably what happened. And Sergeant Sienna did not give off how he felt about, what Kevin was doing and what he was saying. He just sort of nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering his theory. However, in reality, Sienna had already considered the possibility of this being a burglary gone wrong But the way Tabitha had actually been killed just felt way too personal to chalk it up to a random intruder. And also, again, nothing from the house had been stolen. So what Sienna really wanted to know from Kevin was, why was Tabitha sleeping on the couch and not up with you? And to Sienna's surprise, Kevin was actually really open about these problems in their marriage. He explained that Tabitha was young, 20 years younger than he was, and she wanted to go to clubs and see friends every night of the week, while he was, usually too busy and too tired for doing that kind of stuff, so she would do it alone. Kevin said that once he'd realized his marriage was actually in trouble because of this dynamic, he said he'd put a lot of effort in to try to fix it by taking Tabitha out more often. And he'd thought things were basically back on track until a few months ago when he'd found out that she was actually having an affair. He said he'd drawn up divorce papers and been on the verge of filing them, but Tabitha had ultimately promised that she would break off the affair, so he had decided to give her one more chance. As Kevin said this, Sienna watched him very closely, trying to gauge whether or not Kevin was lying. Kevin definitely seemed nervous as he was speaking, and he also kept tapping his foot and running his fingers through his hair. But there was a chance that was also just exhaustion and maybe some shock, lingering shock. Sienna checked his watch and saw it was almost 9 o'clock, and he knew Kevin by this point had been awake for about 24 hours. But Sienna didn't want to just let him off the hook right now, because if Kevin was guilty, if he really did kill his wife or had something to do with it, Sienna knew he might never get a better shot at a confession than right now. So he decided he would just push Kevin to his breaking point and see if he'd crack. 8 hours later, around 4 p.m., Sienna stared at Kevin from across an interview room at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in downtown Rochester. Kevin was sort of slumped in his chair with his head buried in his hands, and he kept complaining about migraines. Now, Sienna was not surprised that Kevin might be feeling worn out right about now, because he'd been answering questions for the last 17 hours. And they'd covered everything from the details of Kevin and Tabitha's relationship to their extended families, including the fact that Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, had lived with them for a few months earlier in the year and it had sort of ended badly. And by this point, Kevin had made it clear that he actually thought Keith Cromwell, the guy Tabitha had been cheating on him with, should be a suspect, and Sienna had to agree. However, what Sienna couldn't get over right now was just how angry Kevin sounded whenever he mentioned Keith. I mean, he was truly enraged. He clearly was not remotely over his wife's affair. And so now Sienna was trying to gauge if maybe Kevin was angry enough about this to have committed murder. And so Sienna decided he would push Kevin a little bit further and extend the interview. And he did this by suggesting that they go ahead and order dinner. And at that point, Kevin, who was totally mad, he jumped up out of his chair and he said that unless he was under arrest, he needed to go back to his kids. And Sienna did not have the evidence to hold Kevin, so he had no choice but to tell him that, of course, he was free to leave. And as Sienna watched a deputy escort Kevin out of the room, he felt a little disappointed that he had not managed to get a confession. But he had gotten some pretty promising leads. Primarily, there was Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, who definitely sounded like he knew a lot about Kevin and Tabitha's relationship, and he could have some good insights. And also, Sienna was thinking, as soon as possible, he needed to speak to Keith, who was Tabitha's affair partner. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Sienna sat across from a broad-shouldered, bald, middle-aged man in the living room of a small house outside of Rochester. This was Keith Cromwell, the man that Tabitha had been having an affair with, and he struck Sienna as being a pretty tough, intense guy. So Sienna was actually a bit taken aback when he asked Keith about his affair with Tabitha, and Keith just began to cry. It just seemed sort of uncharacteristic for the way he appeared, at least at first glance. But Keith quickly wiped his eyes and he apologized, and then he asked what exactly Sienna wanted to know. And Sienna told him to just, start at the beginning. So Keith explained that he was a machine operator at a local factory, and it was a really stressful job. So Keith would sometimes blow off steam by going to a nearby strip club. And it was at that strip club about 6 months earlier that he had met Tabitha Bryant. And this really caught Sienna off guard, and he immediately asked Keith, what was Tabitha doing there at the strip club? But Keith just shrugged and said Tabitha had a wild side. She was a regular there. Sienna was still sort of taken aback by this and really didn't know what to think of it, but he just told Keith to keep telling his story. And so Keith continued, and he explained how he and Tabitha had exchanged numbers that first night, and then started texting and calling, and how that eventually turned into regular meetups when Kevin was at work. He said by July, they were hanging out several times a week and speaking on the phone basically every day. And Keith said this continued right up until Tabitha's death. And here, Sienna had to stop Keith again, because Kevin had told Sienna that Tabitha and Keith, their affair, was over. But here Keith was basically telling Sienna the opposite. And so when Sienna pressed him on it, Keith said that actually Tabitha had called him around 11 p.m. on Sunday night, only about an hour before she was killed. And so this timing just felt like way too big of a coincidence, and it made Sienna wonder if Keith was actually just trying to give himself an alibi. Except it was not a very good one, because Keith lived close enough to Tabitha and Kevin that after that last phone call at about 11 o'clock, he would have had time to hang up the phone and drive over to their house and commit the murder by midnight. So this really wasn't an alibi. So now Sienna realized he was in a tough spot here. Tabitha's affair really gave both Kevin and Keith strong motives to want to kill her. And so basically neither man could be ruled out. They were kind of like equally primary suspects at this point. And on top of that, the additional information that Tabitha had been a regular at a strip club just raised a lot of additional questions. He realized he really needed to speak to someone who really knew Tabitha. Five days later, on July 19, 2003, Sergeant Sienna stood inside of a cemetery at the back of a group of mourners and watched as Tabitha Bryant's casket was lowered into the ground. Sienna had come to Tabitha's funeral not only to pay his respects, but also because he was looking for her half-brother, Cyril, and he had two reasons he really wanted to speak to him. First of all, he thought Cyril might have some additional unique insights into Tabitha's various relationships. I mean, Cyril had lived with Tabitha and Kevin and their kids earlier that year, and Sienna had heard that Cyril and Tabitha were quite close, and so maybe she had shared some additional insights that he would know. But the second reason for wanting to speak to Cyril was recently, Sienna had also begun to look at Cyril as being maybe a potential suspect. So Sienna had spoken with a number of Tabitha's friends, and from those interviews, Sienna had learned that Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy were also both regulars at that same strip club that Tabitha went to. And then on top of that, Sienna knew that, Cyril and Cassidy had been caught using drugs by Tabitha and Kevin, and that's why they had been booted from the house just a few months ago. And so who knows, there could be some bad blood there. And so this made Sienna wonder if Tabitha's murder might have had nothing to do with her affair, and everything to do with, very likely some fight that she had had with Cyril and Cassidy when she caught them and kicked them out. But now, as Sienna scanned the funeral crowd, he didn't see anybody who matched Cyril's description. And so when the service ended and all the mourners began making their way out to the parking lot, Sienna hustled over to Tabitha's mother, and he asked her, had Cyril attended the funeral? And she said that actually, no one had heard from Cyril since the night Tabitha was killed. And she said that she was really worried about him because Cyril's mental health was quite fragile. About a year earlier, he'd suffered a huge mental breakdown after the death of another sibling, which was why Tabitha had invited him to live with her in the first place. And so now Tabitha's mom was afraid that Cyril had spiraled again and might be in trouble. But as empathetic as Sienna was, ultimately, this information he was getting from the mother did not paint Cyril as like a guy in need of help. It painted Cyril as being really suspicious. And so as politely as he could, Sienna asked the mom if she had any idea of how he could go about trying to find Cyril, any way he could even begin that process. And Tabitha's mom, she thought for a moment and then said that if anyone knew where Cyril was, it was his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. One night, about a week after Tabitha's funeral, Sergeant Sienna sat in the back of an unmarked van in downtown Rochester. And through the windshield, he watched a man standing alone in an alley, pacing back and forth, constantly checking his phone. This was all part of a sting operation that Sienna hoped would finally lead him to Tabitha's half-brother Cyril. Ever since Tabitha's funeral, he and his fellow deputies have been trying to track Cyril down, but so far they'd had no luck. It looked an awful lot like Cyril had either left town or was actively hiding from the police. However, Sienna had managed to locate Cyril's girlfriend, Cassidy, who, it would turn out, was well known to the police for being a drug dealer and an escort, who went by the working name of Angel. Now, Sienna doubted that if he approached Cassidy directly, that she would just immediately give up Cyril's location willingly, and so what he needed to do was, get leverage on her first. So Sienna went to an informant of his with a plan. The informant would reach out to Cassidy, or Angel, looking to buy some cocaine, and then once they had clear evidence that she had broken the law by selling these drugs, Sienna would arrest her and then try to strike a deal to get her to talk about Cyril. And so now, through a pair of binoculars, Sergeant Sienna watched as a small blonde woman appeared at the far end of the alley. His heartbeat picked up as he realized it was definitely Cassidy, and he watched as she walked right up the alley and began talking to the informant, the man who had been pacing before on his phone. And when Sienna saw the money and drugs change hands, he gave the command on his radio to go ahead and move in. In an instant, 2 police cars rounded the corner with their sirens blaring, cutting off both ends of the alley. Cassidy looked completely startled and started to run before the arriving deputies boxed her in, and moments later, they had her in handcuffs. The following morning, Sienna stood outside of an interview room at the sheriff's office in Rochester, New York. He looked through a two-way mirror, and on the other side of the glass, he watched a deputy question Cassidy, the girlfriend of Tabitha's half-brother Cyril, who was still missing and still a major suspect. Now, Cassidy had been completely stonewalling police since they'd arrested her for selling cocaine the night before, and she was still insisting that she had no idea where Cyril was or why he'd disappeared. Now, to this point, the deputy who was speaking to Cassidy had not brought up Tabitha's murder. And so at this point, Cassidy seemed to think that her only problem was the cocaine charge. And so as Sienna watched this interview just kind of go in circles and drag because Cassidy just was not giving them anything, finally Sienna just couldn't take it anymore, and he just busted in the room and he slammed a folder down right on the table, totally shocking not just the deputy, but Cassidy. They both looked at him like, "What are you doing?" And then before Cassidy could say or do anything, Sienna looked right at her and just said, "I don't care about your drug charge. What I want to know is what you know about Tabitha Bryant's murder." And at first, Cassidy just stared back at Sienna and said nothing. And for a minute, Sienna thought maybe he had sort of miscalculated here. But then after a long, awkward pause, Cassidy's whole demeanor shifted and she started to talk. Based on witness testimony, evidence collected at the crime scene, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Tabitha Bryant on the night of July 13th, 2003. Around 11:50 p.m., the killer very carefully crept through the first floor of the Bryant home carrying a rifle, and they went straight to the den where they found Tabitha asleep on the pull-out couch. For a moment, the killer paused, just staring down at Tabitha, wondering, questioning whether they could really go through with this. But then, after just a little bit of deliberation in their own minds, they raised the rifle and they fired. The bullet entered Tabitha's skull right under her right eye, but it didn't kill her. And so as the killer is standing there watching, expecting Tabitha to basically be motionless, Tabitha wasn't. Her body began jerking around, and then she suddenly reached up and grabbed at her cheek, and she sat up and she looked at the killer and began to scream. And so the killer immediately fired 2 more times, but Tabitha was moving around so much in her own panic that both shots missed. And then on the 4th shot, when the killer pulled the trigger for the 4th time, the rifle jammed. And so at this point, the killer completely panicked. And so the killer turns and they run into the kitchen,
All the while, Tabitha is flailing around in the den. She's screaming, blood's going everywhere. And the killer, they grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen, they run back into the den, and when they get there, they see Tabitha is now standing. And she's clutching at her face, she's screaming, and the killer tackles her back onto the bed and begins stabbing her over and over again in the neck and the chest until she does finally go limp. When the killer climbed off of Tabitha and stood back up, they realized they, like the rest of the room, were covered in blood. And so the killer began just sort of backing away from the scene, not really sure what they were going to do. And as they're doing this, they hear a noise behind them, and they whip around, and they see there was a figure coming down the stairs. And when this figure got to the bottom of the stairs, they walked right up to the killer and handed them an envelope. And the killer took the envelope, blood all over them. They take the envelope, they open it up, they look inside to confirm that yes, it was stuffed with $100 bills. It would turn out the person who actually wielded the rifle and the knife and literally killed Tabitha was her half-brother Cyril. He got covered in blood so that the real mastermind, Tabitha's husband, Kevin, could keep his hands clean. Kevin paid Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy $5,000 to do his dirty work for him. Cyril committed the murder, and Cassidy drove the getaway car. But long before they got to the house that night, Kevin was setting things up so that the murder would go according to his plan. Kevin opened the garage and unlocked the door to the house so that Cyril could come inside no problem. And when he found Tabitha in their bed upstairs, he woke her up and told her to head on down to the den, where he knew Cyril would look for her. Kevin was motivated by anger over Tabitha's affair with Keith, and also the fear that he would lose his kids if they got divorced. But ironically, it was actually Kevin's own actions that drove Tabitha, literally, into Keith's arms. Kevin portrayed himself as this, hardworking lawyer who basically was a workaholic, and all he did was provide for his family. But in reality, he was a drug and sex addict who routinely brought sex workers to his law office. His idea of working on his marriage, as he said he and Tabitha were doing after he discovered her affair, really just involved taking Tabitha to strip clubs and then pressuring her into having group sex with other sex workers. And then he would also pressure her to give lap dances to the other clientele. And one of those other clientele was Keith. That's how they met. Kevin and Cyril were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. As for Cassidy, she ultimately took a plea deal and received 15 years.
One morning in the early spring of 1943, a 29-year-old woman named Carolyn hunched over a sink basin that was inside of a laboratory in a U.S. government building in Washington, D.C. And this basin was full of this greenish-blue liquid that smelled so bad it actually was making Carolyn nauseous. But she couldn't leave the room because this was her job. This was a highly classified and potentially life-saving thing that she was doing. And so Carolyn checked the recipe one more time on the clipboard right next to her, and then measured out 1 cup of the special type of acidic salt, and she poured it into the liquid, and she sort of plugged her nose as it began to bubble and more gross vapors began to come up into the air. So Carolyn worked for a government agency called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA. Carolyn had actually tried first to join the Navy and also the Army. She had applied to do administrative work because at the time, women were not allowed to do anything in combat roles. However, both the Navy and the Army turned her down for a really weird reason. So at the time, these two branches of the military were looking for people to fill their administrative roles. Namely, they were looking for secretaries. But specifically, they were seeking secretaries who could take notes in meetings and go basically completely unnoticed. But Carolyn was sort of impossible to ignore. She was 6'2" tall, and she had a booming voice and a huge personality. And so basically, she drew a lot of attention, and the military had known that very likely her presence would be too distracting in these meetings, and so that's why they turned her down. So when she was rejected, Carolyn had gone on to apply for work at the OSS, hoping to maybe become a spy. but they also turned her down really for the same reason. She was just too conspicuous to blend into a crowd, so how could she possibly be a spy? Now, for Carolyn, this had been sort of heartbreaking. It was sort of like, she thought she was going to be able to serve her country, and now she's being told, you basically can't. And so feeling like, she didn't have much to lose, she just went to the OSS and just said, look, I know I can't be a spy, but do you have any other jobs available that I could do? What do you got? Anything. I'm open to it. And it was through this approach that the OSS said, actually, yes, we do have something for you. And she would go on to become the executive assistant to one of the lead scientists for the OSS. And so now, in that capacity, she was working on a very important secret science project for the government. And so that day in the lab, after the mixture had stopped bubbling a little bit, Carolyn very carefully added some more ingredients. There was some copper acetate and black food dye, and then once they were in the wash basin as well, it was done. At this point, Carolyn very carefully scooped some of this mixture up in a ladle, and she poured it into a glass beaker and then handed it off to a lab assistant and told him she had followed the recipe exactly. He took the mixture and thanked her and told her he was now going to dehydrate it into several solid cakes, and then they would test it. A few weeks later, Carolyn was back in the laboratory copying some notes from some of the more recent versions of the experiment she'd been working on. And she looked up when her boss, a scientist named Major Harold J. Coolidge, walked into the room. Major Coolidge was a scientist from Harvard University, and he was in charge of this whole secret project that Carolyn was working on. And he walked in and he had a big smile on his face, and he put a memo down on the table in front of Carolyn. And Carolyn grabbed it and she read it over, and as she did, her heart began to race. The memo said that the US Navy had taken different versions of the dehydrated cakes that they had been making out into the ocean to shark-infested waters and then attached these cakes to bags of raw fish meat and submerged them in the water. And a lot of curious sharks had come over to investigate the meat, but none of them had actually taken a bite. And this was exactly what Carolyn and her boss and her colleagues had all hoped for. So the government had basically hired the OSS to create a brand new life-saving product, shark repellent. And soon, this very same shark repellent that Carolyn worked on was actually issued to the entire US Navy. However, while this shark repellent was undoubtedly Carolyn's first big recipe, it would not be her last. After she left the OSS, she eventually moved to Paris, France, where her life would change forever. Because there, Carolyn fell in love with French cuisine. And even though she had literally zero culinary training aside from, mixing up shark repellent recipes, she enrolled at a legendary culinary school called Le Cordon Bleu. Now, she was the only woman in her class, and at first, because again, she had no skills in cooking, she really struggled to hang on to the curriculum. But she would figure it out, and eventually she would not just graduate, she would go on to become an exceptionally talented chef. She went on to co-author a cookbook that sold more than 3.5 million copies, and then after that, she landed a deal for a cooking show on TV. And viewers all over the world not only loved her cooking, but they really just fell in love with her, like her personality. And so she would go on to become one of the most beloved and influential chefs in history, credited with bringing French cooking into American homes. Before there was Gordon Ramsay or Barefoot Contessa, there was Carolyn, a 6'2" celebrity chef with a booming voice and a magnetic personality who used to make shark repellent. The very traits that initially kept her from serving her country made her unforgettable in every kitchen in America. Her middle name was Carolyn, but you know her as Julia Child. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS Debt for a real solution. PDS Debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS Debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment with zero credit impact. And savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS Debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS Debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/Mr. Ballin. On the afternoon of June 12, 1962, an 18-year-old boy named George Jr. drove through his hometown of Modesto, California, on his way home for dinner. But as he was driving, George Jr. could not help but feel like he was really dreading actually getting there. So he and his father had been fighting a lot lately, ever since he had told his dad that he did not want to go to college, and instead he wanted to become a race car driver. And his dad thought this was a ridiculous idea and that George Jr. was wasting his potential. So George Jr. was a very smart kid. In particular, he was very good at art and photography, but he also got distracted really easily, and because of that, he really had not pursued anything all that seriously at any point in his life. That is, except for cars. A few years back, George Jr. had begun hanging around mechanic shops and sort of fell in love with cars. He thought they were fascinating. And at that point, his father actually bought him a small Italian car called a Fiat. And George Jr., after getting this car, sort of became obsessed with it, and he wound up souping up the engine and basically turned this little car into sort of like a race car. And he'd actually begun entering his little car into local car races. And he'd actually even won a few of these races. But his father, despite being the one who literally gave him the Fiat, he just didn't get his son's obsession with cars. Like, why aren't you able to, take that focus and apply it to other things, that will get you a real job and give you a real future? And so basically every dinner these days, it became this huge argument between father and son. But, George Jr., as frustrated as he was with the whole situation, couldn't really change it, at least not for now, because he still lived with his parents, and so he just had to accept that if they were going to fight, they were going to fight. And so George, he came to this intersection where it was right near his home. He just needed to make a left and, pull over, and he was home. He comes to a stop, he puts on his blinker, and he begins making the turn when he hears this really loud screeching sound and then feels his own car jolt forward, and then everything went black. 2 weeks later, George Jr. was laying in a hospital bed in the intensive care unit at the local hospital, watching daytime reruns on the TV in his room. He was in so much pain that he could barely move, so all he did was just watch TV. So 2 weeks earlier, when George was, making that turn and then something happened, well, what it was is another car came speeding down the road and smashed into George's car so hard that it sent his car, his little Fiat, flying, and it flipped 3 times. And while it was flipping, George Jr. was ejected from the car, and actually it saved his life because the moment he was ejected, his car smashed into a tree and sort of wrapped around it. I mean, George was very badly hurt. He had multiple bone fractures, bruised lungs. I mean, he was really beaten up, but he had survived. However, the doctors told him that because of how extensive his injuries were, he would basically be recovering in bed in the hospital for months. But again, George Jr. just felt lucky to be alive at this point. And really, as he laid in bed, watching TV and just sort of stuck there, he began to think that, maybe this is my wake-up call. Maybe I do need to make some changes in my life. 2 years later, George Jr., who by this point was fully recovered from his injuries, stood at the finish line at a racetrack and raised his camera. And the race cars came whipping toward him on their last lap, and he snapped the photo finish. So since his near-death experience, George Jr. had made some big decisions. In the hospital after his accident, he had realized that really, his dad had been kind of right, that in some ways he was wasting his potential. So after getting out of the hospital, George Jr. had enrolled in community college, and he really applied himself to his schoolwork, to the point where his father was really impressed. Also, George Jr. had decided that he really didn't want to race cars anymore. He loved cars still, but it just felt like it was sort of reckless and not so much his thing anymore. Instead, he had, along with, focusing on his schoolwork, he had also picked up his camera and really gotten back into his old hobby of photography. In fact, George Jr. had grown to love photography so much that after community college, he had applied to the prestigious cinematography program at the University of Southern California. But after sending off his application, he was pretty sure he would not get in, because despite his efforts with his schoolwork at community college, he still knew his grades likely were not up to snuff. Now, George Jr. walked over to the podium to take some photos of the winning driver. But as he walked over there, this middle-aged man came up beside him and just asked George Jr. about his photography. They spoke for a few minutes, and then at some point, the man actually formally introduced himself as Haskell Wexler. And he said that he was actually a cinematographer in Hollywood. And George Jr., when he heard this, he sort of felt starstruck. And he told Haskell about how he had recently applied to USC to try to get into their cinematography program, but, he felt like it was kind of a long shot. And when Haskell heard this, he said, "George, I know people at USC. Let me make some calls. I'll get you in." And sure enough, not long after this fateful meeting, George Jr. would receive an acceptance letter from USC's film school. But this moment in George Jr.'s life, receiving this unbelievable acceptance letter, did not just alter George's life forever. It also would go on to completely alter cinema in general forever. Because about 13 years later, George Jr. would go on to create one of the most groundbreaking films in history. His movie revolutionized sound design and visual effects, and it would go on to become part of the most successful movie franchise of all time. George Jr. is better known today as George Lucas, and his film franchise was Star Wars. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1938, 8-year-old Carolyn Jones hurried after her mother as they both carried platters of food down a street in Amarillo, Texas. It was Easter Sunday, and Carolyn and her mother were going to their neighbor's house to celebrate the holiday. Carolyn's dad was not in the picture, so when they had moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, Carolyn's mom had made a big effort to get to know their neighbors to make sure that they had a lot of friends and community and support around them. And so as a result, Carolyn's mom had actually really bonded with a specific middle-aged couple whose name was Mr. and Mrs. Franklin that lived right down the street. And that's whose house they were going to right now. And Carolyn was really excited because the Franklins had always been so nice to her, and this holiday dinner usually meant sweets and some fun Easter games like decorating eggs. Less than an hour later, Carolyn, her mother, and the Franklins were all sitting around the table eating some food. The grown-ups were having a very animated discussion about something very boring, and Carolyn was feeling just completely antsy. She just wanted this very boring adult part of the evening to end so she could have some candy and go play. And so while she's feeling this way, the phone rang in the Franklin's house. And since the grown-ups were very busy talking, Mrs. Franklin asked Carolyn if she wouldn't mind going and answering the phone and seeing who it was. So Carolyn, who was excited to have really anything to do at this point, she jumped up and she grabbed the phone and said, "Hello." And on the other end was an operator who said this was a collect call coming in from somebody named Joyce. Carolyn knew that Joyce was the Franklins' adult daughter. And also Carolyn knew from her own mother that Joyce had moved away a few years ago to go to school in Missouri. So when Carolyn heard this, she called over to the table and said there was a collect call coming in from Joyce. But when she did this, the room, which just a second ago had been, sort of noisy as the adults were chatting the whole time, the room went completely silent. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin just stared at Carolyn, and to Carolyn's surprise, they sort of looked mad. Then Mr. Franklin got up and he walked over to Carolyn and sort of aggressively took the phone out of Carolyn's hand, and then to the operator, he said, "Put the call through." Carolyn felt like she'd done something wrong, but she had no idea what. So she was just feeling totally shocked and embarrassed and just kind of stepped aside to watch Mr. Franklin as he listened to the caller speak. It would turn out that in past years, at Easter dinners before this one, the Franklin's daughter, Joyce, would always make the drive home from her school in Missouri to be with her parents in Texas. And in years past, when she couldn't make the trip, she had always been really good about calling her parents and letting them know. And that was what Joyce had been calling about that night. When her father answered the phone and Joyce was put through, she said, "Daddy, I can't get home." But this year, Joyce's call was not routine. In fact, it was like the single most shocking thing that could have happened. Because a year earlier, during last Easter, when Joyce had been literally on her way home from school to see her parents, she'd gotten in a car accident and died. No one was ever able to explain that phone call, but the experience of being the one who actually answered the phone and being there when Mr. Franklin's face went white and he fainted, like that experience for 8-year-old Carolyn was incredibly formative. In fact, in many ways, it's like her life changed in that exact moment. And from that point forward, Carolyn really went on to fully embrace the macabre in her life. And through that, she ultimately became a very famous actress and scream queen, appearing in dozens of thrillers and horror films. Her most iconic macabre role was being Morticia Addams in the original Addams Family TV series.
Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon drove his work truck along a paved road in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is this huge nature preserve in southern Wyoming. Carl had taken off early from his job on an oil rig to go elk hunting in this preserve, and now he was heading towards this very specific area in the national forest called McMarty Canyon that he had heard was really good for elk hunting. As Carl drove, he found himself looking around at the evergreen trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and he just felt this total sense of calm come over him. He was a very rugged outdoorsman, and there was really nothing he loved more than spending time out in nature all alone. And so for a little while, he was just enjoying himself, driving along, until eventually the paved road he was on gave way to this long, rocky trail. And Carl, he didn't want to damage the truck he was driving, since it actually belonged to the company he worked for, so he wound up pulling over and getting out, and then he just grabbed all his stuff and continued walking on the trail by foot. The hike along this trail was not only, pretty rocky and rough, but it was also predominantly uphill, and so it didn't take long before Carl was having trouble breathing. And not just because it was physically taxing, but also because when he was younger, he had tuberculosis, which had left his lungs really riddled with scar tissue that did make it harder to breathe, especially when he was exerting himself. But, Carl continued on, and every few minutes he would just stop and bend over and catch his breath. But after about 30 minutes or so, he had hiked to the point where the trees had begun to thin out, and then he found himself standing inside what looked like a big bowl in the earth. So this was McMarty Canyon, where he was, intending to go for this elk hunt. And, the reason it sort of felt like a bowl is because it was mostly just flat with some shrubs and grass, a few trees, and these tall hills out on the sides, sort of giving this impression of a bowl. And so Carl, he sort of just stopped and took stock of the area. And wouldn't you know it, when he looked straight across the canyon, the bowl, he saw a group of just 5 elk grazing in the distance. Like, this was unbelievably lucky. Here they are, right away. And so Carl slowly began walking towards them, doing his best not to make any noise. And then when he was within shooting distance, he just stopped, raised his rifle, and he looked through his sights to aim at the first elk he saw, and then he pulled the trigger. But for some reason, when he pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off. It didn't fire, or at least it didn't appear to. And certainly there wasn't any kickback. It just was like nothing happened. But then he saw something that just didn't make any logical sense. And at the same time he's experiencing this just insane phenomenon, he felt this massive wave of vertigo, and then he just sort of felt himself falling, and then he blacked out. The next thing Carl knew, he felt himself being shaken back and forth, and he sort of slowly began to blink his eyes, feeling very confused and disoriented. His head was pounding, it was clearly dark outside, and then he realized, sort of with horror, that Somehow he was back inside of his work truck, but the surroundings outside of the truck definitely looked different, like the truck was parked in a different spot than where he'd left it. He suddenly felt himself getting shaken again, and then he heard someone say his name. And he looked up, and in the darkness, he saw there were two men that he didn't recognize who were clearly shaking him, trying to get his attention. And they tried to ask him, like, what was going on? But Carl's mouth sort of felt numb. And when he tried to speak, it's like the words came out garbled and nonsensical. And so at some point, these two men sort of gave up trying to talk to Carl. And they just lifted him up, pulled him out of the truck, and they carried him over to their vehicle. And Carl heard them say something about a hospital, and then before long, their car was driving off, and then Carl blacked out again. About 30 minutes later, around midnight on October 26th, so this is 8 hours after Carl first blacked out, his wife Marjorie rushed into a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Wyoming. And inside, she saw Carl lying on the bed, hooked up to an IV, and there were a bunch of monitors with a nurse standing beside him. And she saw, her husband's eyes were open, but clearly unfocused. And then as Marjorie is just standing there, taking in the initial shock of what she's seeing, the nurse actually pointed at her, at Marjorie, and then asked Carl if he knew who she, his wife, who she was. But Carl, he turned and he looked at Marjorie, but he just kind of stared blankly and then shook his head and said no. So earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, waiting for Carl to come back from his hunting trip. But when he hadn't shown up on time, she ultimately had called the sheriff's department and asked them to go to McMarty Canyon just to check on him. And so two deputies had gone out there and they found him, and he was unconscious in his truck. So those two deputies were the ones who obviously shook him awake and took him to the hospital. But interestingly, beyond the fact that the deputies had no idea what happened to him, they reported that his truck had been parked 3 miles away from the main road in this muddy bog, and strangely, there were no tire tracks leading to it. It was almost like it was just dropped in the bog with, Carl inside of it. But, despite this weirdness, the deputies, and Marjorie for that matter, were not concerned about, the weirdness around the truck. They were worried about Carl, who's just laying here unconscious. And so they had rushed him to the hospital, and Marjorie had driven there as fast as she could. A doctor had already explained to Marjorie that her husband was, clearly very disoriented and seemed to be suffering from a case of amnesia. He couldn't even remember his own name, let alone, what had happened to him while he was out in that canyon before the deputies showed up and found him passed out in his truck. Doctors had given Carl x-rays and brain scans and run all kinds of tests on him, but not only did they not find any evidence of some sort of head injury, that likely would have caused his amnesia, but they actually didn't find anything wrong with him at all. He seemed perfectly fine beyond him just showing up basically unconscious and disoriented. And so realistically, the staff told Marjorie that because they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. And so for now, Carl was just being kept in the hospital under constant observation. And so Marjorie just took a seat on the couch next to her husband's bed, sort of not even sure what to think of this whole situation. And she was about to ask the nurse a couple of questions, but then suddenly Carl sort of tensed up and began frantically looking around the room, like he really had something in mind that he was looking for. And then he began saying, where are my pills? Marjorie had no idea what pills her husband was talking about, and it was clear the nurse also didn't know what he was talking about. And so Marjorie, she reached out and just tried to grab her husband's hand to try to calm him down. But the moment she did that, Carl sort of stopped what he was doing, and he yanked his hand away and stared at her like she was a total stranger. 2 days later, Carl still could not remember what had happened to him when he had gone hunting. But he had recovered some basic memories, like his own name and also who his wife was. And so between that and the fact that realistically Carl did not have any signs of any physical injury, the hospital discharged him and just sent him home with Marjorie and basically told her that he was probably fine and that he probably just needed to be in a familiar place to sort of recover all of his memories and get back to normal. However, when the couple got back home, it very quickly became clear to Marjorie that Carl was not okay and he was not getting better. For the most part, Carl was just unusually quiet at home, like uncharacteristically quiet. And then when he would speak, it often was in that frantic sort of nonsensical way that he had spoken in the hospital when he was, looking for his pills. And in fact, when he was home, he did continue to suddenly start looking for his pills. And then also he began telling Marjorie that, somebody had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to ask him, like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean your pills? What do you mean somebody took your elk? Like, what are you talking about? But Carl didn't even seem to know. Like, he would have moments of recognizing that it's so crazy what he's saying, but he just didn't have the memories to be filled in. It was like Carl was just as confused by his own vague memories as his wife was. However, a few days after they got home from the hospital, Carl suddenly told his wife that he'd actually remembered something really specific about what had happened when he was hunting. Like a new memory had popped up in his mind. He told her that when he was in McMarty Canyon and he saw those elk and he raised his rifle and he pulled the trigger, he said there was no sound, there was no kickback, it was like nothing had happened. But then he said something happened that truly just didn't make logical sense. He said he realized the gun had fired, but it was like the world had slowed down and he could actually literally see the bullet leaving the rifle, but like in slow motion. Like this bullet is trickling out of the gun and slowly making its way, across the canyon, and he's just staring at this bullet. And then the bullet seemed to strike like an invisible wall of sorts, at which point the bullet actually stopped and almost flipped inside out and sort of flattened and then fell to the ground. And then also as the flattened inside out bullet fell to the ground, Carl said he too fell to the ground and he blacked out. Now, when Marjorie heard this, her first thought was this is nonsense. This is not real. This is something maybe Carl's mind has created to fill in the gaps of his memory, because it's got to be really frustrating for him that he's got all these fragments that he can't put together. And so maybe this is just his mind filling in the gaps with this really specific and weird imagery. But not long after hearing this story, Marjorie was doing the laundry and she was finally washing the clothes her husband had on when this whole thing happened out in the canyon. And when she reached into the pockets of his jacket to make sure they were empty before, washing the jacket, she felt something metallic. And she pulled out this round, flat disc, this metal disc. And at first she just had no idea what it was. But then she thought about what her husband had said about the bullet from his rifle, flipping inside out and flattening and falling to the ground. She couldn't help but feel like this metallic disc that she's holding in her hand that was in her husband's jacket looks an awful lot like a bullet that has been flipped inside out and flattened. Like she couldn't believe it. Not long after this discovery of the alleged bullet, Marjorie sat next to her husband on a couch inside of an office at the University of Wisconsin. They were both sitting across from a psychology professor named Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Marjorie knew this meeting was sort of a long shot, but she was hopeful that, maybe they would learn something valuable. So by this point, Carl had not recovered any other memories from his hunting trip. But after, recovering the supposed flattened bullet in her husband's jacket, Marjorie became convinced that something truly strange had happened to her husband. I mean, she obviously knew something happened out in the canyon, but now it just seemed like I don't even have any theories for what could have happened, but something really weird must have happened. And so she and Carl were both very determined to try to figure out what happened. And so that's how they ended up in Dr. Sprinkle's office. Dr. Sprinkle was not your average psychologist. He was a really big believer in hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis. And specifically, he believed that hypnosis could potentially allow people to access repressed memories, which is exactly what Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle, and Carl for that matter, believed was going on with Carl, that he had experienced something that was being repressed, but it was in there. You just need to find a way to access it. So that day in the professor's office, Marjorie stayed very quiet and just observed while Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to close his eyes, to relax his head down towards his chest, and just focus on his breathing, in and out, in and out. And after several minutes of this, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head back up. And Carl did, but when he looked up, his eyes were actually still closed. And at this point, Dr. Sprinkle asked Carl to tell him what happened on October 25th
when he went elk hunting in McMarty Canyon. And Carl, with his eyes still shut, began to speak really fluently, and he began telling just the most insane story Marjorie, or Dr. Sprinkle for that matter, had ever heard. Carl said, again under hypnosis here, that after he had watched that bullet leave his rifle in slow motion and hit this invisible wall and flip inside out and fall to the ground, he said that he too had fallen basically at the same speed as this bullet onto the ground, and basically he passed out. But he only blacked out for like a second. And when he opened his eyes, he said he was still lying on the grass in the middle of this canyon. Except now, standing over him was this tall, dark figure that was wearing almost like a very tight-fitting bodysuit, almost like what a scuba diver would wear. And Carl said this figure was vaguely, human-shaped, but it had very yellowish skin and very small eyes and no ears and no lips. And there were two antennas sticking out of, its forehead. And one of its arms extended into this flat stump, but the other arm seemed to have almost like a prosthetic attachment at the end of it that almost looked like a power drill. And then, in perfect English, this figure sort of looked down at Carl and just said, "How are you?" And Carl said he was so stunned by this thing speaking to him in perfect English that Carl just sort of blurted out, "Oh, pretty good, pretty good." And the figure seemed satisfied with this answer, and it went on to quickly explain that its name was Ozo 1, and it came from a planet 163,000 light years away from Earth. And it said it had no intention of hurting Carl. In fact, it said it wanted to help Carl. Then, with the hand that sort of resembled a power drill, it reached into what looked like a pocket on its bodysuit, and it pulled out this small packet containing 4 pills. And it told Carl that these pills would heal him. And then this thing offered Carl one of these pills. And Carl, for reasons he couldn't explain, just immediately took the pill and swallowed it. And then after that, Carl said that Osso 1 asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl just said, "Sure." So Osso 1 helped Carl off the ground, and then as soon as Carl was standing back up again, he saw there was this cube-shaped vehicle not far away. And a split second later, Carl said he was somehow inside of this vehicle, along with Osso 1, and also 2 other vaguely humanoid figures, and the 5 elk that he'd been out here hunting. They were behind this clear wall like a containment pen within the vehicle. And Carl was seated in a chair, as was Osso 1 and the 2 other humanoids. They were all just sort of sitting there. Then Carl said he felt this powerful force push against his body, like the vehicle was moving so fast that it basically pushed him back into his seat. But less than a minute later, the vehicle just stopped, and Osso 1 said, "We're home." At this point, Carl was just suddenly standing outside of the vehicle. And he said it felt very cold, and the sky was jet black. And then around Carl, the landscape was very different from planet Earth. It was very rocky and desolate without any trees or grass or really any organic-looking life anywhere. And then in front of Carl, he said he saw this massive metallic-looking tower that sort of reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. And there was this light on the top of it that was actually so bright that Carl said when he looked at it, it sort of hurt his eyes. And so Ozo 1 led Carl, the 2 other humanoid figures, and the elk to a door on the outside of this tower. And once they were standing outside of it, Carl said the door slid open, but instead of it sort of leading into the tower, it just led to what reminded Carl of the inside of a large elevator. And the whole group just got on board and began riding up. And then when this elevator of sorts came to a stop and the door opened again, Carl saw this small room with metal walls and a handful of what looked like platforms on the floor. Ozo 1 led the elk onto one of those platforms and told Carl to get on one too. And so Carl just did as he was told and stood on one of these platforms. And then out of nowhere, some kind of high-tech device emerged from these metallic walls and began sort of circling around Carl. It went from his head all the way to his toes, basically like scanning him. Carl was vaguely aware of the same process taking place to the elk as well. And then when this scanner was done, it made a beeping sound, and then Ozo 1 looked over at Carl and told him, "Well, the elk are what we needed, but you're not, so we're going to take you back to Earth now."
And then Carl said the next thing he knew, he was just magically back inside of his work truck, like he had somehow been transported there instantaneously, and he was being shaken awake by those two sheriff's deputies. And so back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Marjorie is listening, just completely shocked by what her husband is saying, not even sure what to make of it. And then Dr. Sprinkle, at the end of Carl's story, when he got to the point where he's being shaken awake by the deputies, Dr. Sprinkle snapped his finger, and Carl kind of came to. He opened his eyes and sort of refocused, clearly out of hypnosis. And then they all just kind of sat there, like in total silence, really unsure what to say to each other. But as crazy as Carl's story sounded, there were several very strange facts about Carl's case that, up to this point, nobody had been able to explain. And the story that Carl told while under hypnosis technically accounted for all of them. The first fact that this story explained was that when Carl woke up in his work truck, like magically just appeared in his work truck, it was not just 3 miles away from the main road, it was actually 3 miles away from where he had originally parked it. And this truck was just sitting in a muddy bog with no tire tracks leading up to it. So it was just totally unclear how it got there. And so if you follow along with Carl's story, perhaps when he was transported back to Earth, they, this other creature and the other humanoids, maneuvered the truck with Carl in it into this bog. The second strange fact is that when Marjorie had ballistics experts analyze that flattened presumed bullet that she had found in Carl's jacket, they were just as baffled as she was. Like, they could not come up with any earthly explanation for how a bullet could be flattened and turned inside out. Like, this was not possible. And so again, if you follow Carl's story, perhaps this being is the one that flipped the bullet inside out. And the third and perhaps strangest fact is that when hospital doctors gave Carl x-rays, they found something that should have been medically impossible. All of the tuberculosis scar tissue in Carl's lungs that had plagued him for decades, that had made it so hard to be physical and exercise, they had somehow disappeared. It was as if someone or something had healed him. Despite how unbelievable Carl's story sounded, and despite the fact that hundreds of people have spent decades trying to disprove it, no one has ever found a better explanation for the moving truck, the impossible bullet, and Carl's disappearing scar tissue. Because of that, some researchers believe that Carl Higdon's account could be one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever recorded.